Hello everybody on YouTube. It's Rachel, the Student Witch, and welcome to my short little two-part paranormal series. And I've decided to split this into parts 1 and 2. Part 1 will talk about my experiences throughout childhood until I graduated from high school. So we're talking about the late 1980s into the early 2000s. And then part 2 will go from college to the present moment. So there are many reasons why I wanted to make this video. First of all, it's October, and in the Northern Hemisphere, this is Halloween season. It's a season of ghosts and goblins and witches and ghouls and Halloween wonderfulness. It's the season of pumpkin. Speaking of which, I am drinking Celestial Seasonings Sweet Harvest Pumpkin Black Tea. Fucking delicious. Tastes like a pumpkin pie with black tea. Oh, I love it with some honey. So yeah, it's the season to talk about spooky, ghostly things. Also, if you've seen my most recent videos about death, there's parts 1 and 2 of that, and I'll have that linked in the cards here, but also linked in the description box below. In part 1, I talk about my personal experiences with death, mostly talking about how I was there for my grandmother's death when I was 12 years old and the impact that had on me, that experience, and also my father-in-law's death. So that's part 1, and then part 2 talks about my personal beliefs on death. And so I've dedicated the month of October, or this Samhain season, to death. Oh, and by the way, if you hear a weird noise, it's our neighbors upstairs. Practically every afternoon between the hours of 2 and 4, there are weird noises upstairs, either towards the front of the house, like in the kitchen and living room where we are now, or in the back end of the apartment. My theory is that they have a Roomba because it is so regular and no one is home upstairs, but some machine is like rolling around on the ground, so they must have a Roomba because they have a cat. But anyway, if that picks up on the camera, that's what that is. Sorry about that. So it's the season of death. I'm celebrating death. I'm working with death and, contemplating what death means and how death brings meaning to our lives and all that sort of stuff. And in the second part of that video series that I have linked below that I did recently on death, I talk about my personal beliefs on death. And if you watch that video, you might be confused as to why I'm making this video, because in that video, I talked about how, rationally, I have a very, what some might call, atheist view on death. That when we die, our individual selves, our sense of identity just kind of melts like an ice cube thrown into a hot bathtub. It just melts and returns to being part of the whole. So I, in that sense, I don't believe that there's a part of my soul that is permanent or that survives death. However, and here's where I have to be comfortable with my own contradictions, right? I have had experiences, people in my family have had experiences that I cannot explain. Now, I don't know what ghosts or spirits are. And of course, all sorts of cultures from all around the world have different mythologies and stories about ghosts and demons and goblins and spirit energies or elemental energies. Like, every culture has their stories about these sort of specters and non-human entities or formerly human entities So I don't know if a ghost would be the human soul that exists after death that hasn't moved on like it should. Or maybe it's just some sort of energetic imprint that we leave on an environment when we are really attached to a place, whether that's a piece of land or a place that we frequented when we were alive or a home or something like that. And it's not necessarily a soul, but it's some sort of imprint or energetic kind of footprint left on that place. I have no idea. I have no idea. So on the one hand, I have a very atheist kind of view of death, which can be poetic in its own way and beautiful and appreciated, and it's important to kind of explore that possibility. But on the other hand, I've seen things that I can't explain. So let's begin. So I was born in the late 1980s, 87 to be exact, on a U.S. military base in southern West Germany. Yes, this is back when there was still an East and a West Germany. Right, we were actually there. We weren't in Berlin, but we were in Germany when the wall came down. In, I think, November of 1989 that happened. But anyway, so my very first memory happened when we were still living in Germany. So that must have been sometime between 1987 and 1990, because in 1990 we moved back to the United States because my dad was stationed in Florida, in Pensacola, Florida, in 1990. So we moved to Florida. So sometime between 1987 and 1990, I had this memory. It's my very, very, very first memory. And it took me years to figure out where it came from. And it actually came from, and if anybody has any information on this, please send it my way. But back in the 1980s, I think there was an animated movie version of The Little Prince, Le Petit Prince, right? That was shown on TV. And apparently sometime around 1989, probably, when I was around 2 years old, or maybe early 1990, my sister and I watched it on TV, and there was a scene in that cartoon that became a recurring dream. I wouldn't call it a nightmare, but a recurring dream that I would have over and over and over again. So I was super young, like at most 3 years old, probably more like 2.5 to 3 years old. And in this scene, I remember the little prince, the character, was feeling so lonely because he was by himself on his little planet, right? And in my dream, I imagined myself as that character, and I remember feeling just waves. It felt like waves of loneliness and despair, like really complex emotions that I would say, I mean, I don't know if those kinds of emotions are typical for a 2.5-year-old to feel. Just utter despair and loneliness and feeling afraid because you're so alone, almost feeling trapped. And I'm mentioning this memory not because a ghost appears in it or anything like that, but because it's the first evidence I have of me potentially being something that you might call an empath. Now, when it comes to psychic phenomena, clairvoyance, clairaudience, empaths, and all this, I'm pretty skeptical. I'm very skeptical, actually. A part of me wonders if it's just not a fad or something that people claim, some power they claim to have to boost their egos or something, or to feel like they're super important or powerful, or I don't really know, because I'm very skeptical. And a part of me, specifically with the label of empath, a part of me is very dubious because it seems like from the descriptions and articles I've read online to the YouTube videos I've watched, it seems like they're just describing most of the characteristics that they're describing as just somebody who reads social cues very well, like who can read body language very well. However, the idea of feeling energies coming off of people, but also kind of radiating from the general environment is something that I can really get behind, because that very much explains my interactions with people and with different places. And I don't know if this means I'm a sensitive in some way or if I'm an empath. I don't know. But I really do feel an impact, like, in me when I see someone who's upset. I start feeling it myself. I can walk into a place and immediately I'll feel uncomfortable for some reason, especially if I've never been there before. And when I meet people, I feel like I automatically know them. Even though if I've never met them before, if it's the first time I'm shaking someone's hand, just from looking into their eyes, looking into their face, I feel like I already know what kind of person they are and what their general energies are, if that makes sense. Like, there are some people I've come across in my day-to-day life and in my work and stuff that I just automatically knew, like, no. And is it just because I just read body language really well, or am I really sensitive to that person's vibes or that place's vibes or whatever? Or is it, especially when I encounter people that just, for some reason, I know I can't handle their energy very much, am I just judging them? I don't know. But I'm becoming more and more open to the possibility that there are certain social phenomena and perceptions that might be understudied or not taken seriously, or there might be something to this whole, like, empath thing. And that very first memory from when I was a toddler, having this recurring dream and feeling so just depressed and sad and lonely and it makes me wonder, because I don't know, maybe I just have really strong emotions, I don't know. Or maybe I'm really empathetic. I don't know. It just seems kind of odd, like that kind of a memory so early feels really odd to me, having those kind of very complex emotions to that extent. And I can't really put into words how deeply I felt it, but it felt overwhelming every time I had that dream. Yeah. So let's skip ahead to between 1993 and 1998. These are very specific times. So this is when, between the ages of like 4 to 10 or 11. And this is when we lived in a really, really small town. Of the population at that time was around 2,700 in rural Kentucky. We have moved to Kentucky by this point. So we lived in a really small house in this town in middle of nowhere, western Kentucky. And a few of these memories I have some doubts about, but I'll go ahead and share them. So I remember one night, I can't remember if it was a dream or if I woke up and saw this. I think I remember hearing it when I was awake in the middle of the night. But I remember hearing chains, like chains rattling up and down the hallway in the house one night when I was a kid. And now looking back, this part of Western Kentucky had a history of slavery. There weren't really slaves in Eastern Kentucky because the Appalachian Mountains made it difficult to have large plantations, and Eastern Kentucky is just so isolated and cut off. But Western Kentucky, if you've read the novel by Toni Morrison called Beloved, the main character is a slave from Kentucky that escapes and goes across the Ohio River into Ohio. So that part of Kentucky where we were living did have slaves. Now, were these the chains of slaves, the memory of like slavery in that part of Kentucky, or was it just an overactive child's imagination who maybe read too many ghost stories or watched something spooky on TV that night? I don't know. But I do remember hearing the sound of it. My mom, I talked to her a year or two ago about this. I asked her if she experienced anything weird in that house, and she said that when we were living there, she would regularly see like shadows in the periphery, in her peripheral vision. She would see like movement and shadows in the corner of her eyes, which is kind of creepy. And then now this next memory is really weird, and I fully admit this could just be an overactive child's imagination. I don't know. But I remember when I first started sleeping in one of the bedrooms by myself, because my sister and I used to share a bedroom, and then they cleared out one of the bedrooms and gave it to me to sleep in. I remember feeling like there was something under my bed, which kid didn't fear that there was something under their bed? I mean, did anybody else out there every night like run and jump into their bed because they were afraid something was under there? I think that's a pretty common childhood fear. But I remember one morning I was up in the bed, I was about to get out, and as I turned and looked down, I saw this little green goblin kind of thing. It was probably about the size of my hand, come out and then crawl back under the bed. Now, when we were kids, this is when X-Files was on TV. The original, X-Files. My sister loved that show. She was a couple years older than me, so it was probably more okay for her to watch it, but I watched it with her I think it aired every Friday night or something like that. X-Files was on. So that show freaked the fuck out of me, especially the early seasons. It was creepy. And so I don't know if this was just a daydream or something I saw based on something that spooked me on X-Files, or something else that kind of planted some sort of image in my subconscious, and then my subconscious made me see it because I was afraid of something like that, or if it was really some sort of thing that I saw. I don't know, but it was very green. I remember that, and it was about the size of my hand, and it kind of darted out from under my bed, saw that I saw it, and then darted back under. So there was that, whatever the hell that was. And so around this time is when I really developed an interest in the paranormal, which continues to this day. I love ghost stories, and I love those paranormal TV shows. Not Ghost Adventures, because I can't stand the dudes, or the main dude that hosts that. But what's my guilty pleasure? The Dead Files. If you've checked out that show, I love that show. And it's not because I believe that what's happening is real. I know the magic of editing and things like that, and actors, who knows. But if you suspend that disbelief and let yourself kind of get immersed in the story and the storytelling in each of the episodes, it is creepy as hell. And so that is kind of my guilty pleasure, is the paranormal and ghost stories. And it was when I was a little kid, specifically in this house in Kentucky, that this interest and curiosity began. And so I still to this day have some of my favorite ghost story books that I read over and over and over again when I was a kid. So while we were living in this small town in Kentucky, my parents sent us to a really small Catholic parochial school. I mean, the school, it was from kindergarten through 8th grade, but it probably had less than 150 students total. It was really small. It was also in a really rural part of Kentucky in the neighboring county. And in that school library, I discovered this series of books. Does anybody else know these books? Creepy as fuck, especially the illustrations. And recently I heard that they were trying to print new editions of these books, but they were going to change the illustrations, and like, that's a fucking crime because the illustrations make the books. So this is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, collected from folklore and retold by Alvin Schwartz, and drawings by Stephen Gamble. And there are 3 books in the series: Scary Stories, more Scary Stories, and then Scary Stories 3. And just the artwork, it's so beautiful, but it's also just so, I mean, for a small child, like, keep in mind I was probably about 6 or 7 years old when I came across this series of books. I mean, these sorts of images were just, they were kind of intense. Let me find a good one. They're so graphic is the best word I have to describe them. I mean, and of all the books, it's in the 3rd book that there are 2 images that spooked me out more than anything else. And one of them comes from the story, where is it? Oh, hold on. It might be in this book. The story called Footsteps. Okay, I found them. It's in Scary Stories 3, To Tell in the Dark. It's a story called Footsteps. And look at this image. Is that not creepy? I love it because if you're in a house by yourself and you know you're the only one home, and all of a sudden you hear footsteps walking around, it does produce a claustrophobic, like, your sense of safety has been challenged, or yeah, it's just so creepy seeing the footsteps, or the feet kind of melting through the ceiling and invading your sense of safety and your sense of privacy. But I blame this on X-Files. The image that has haunted me for years is this one. Look at that! What the hell is that? And can you imagine being a 6-year-old coming across that? Yeah, this is the image that my brain always goes to when I think about these books. But these are such good books, such good scary story, chilling books. So yeah, when we first moved to Kentucky, when I was around 4.5 to 5 years old, that's when my interest in the paranormal started. My curiosity. And so from this period between 1993 and 1998, one other weird thing happened when I was at my grandparents' house. And so at this time, my grandparents lived in the neighboring county, in the town that we would eventually move to in 1998. And in the early to mid 90s, their house was kind of surrounded by cow fields. It wasn't really developed like it is now. And so they had a big backyard that I loved to play in. I would run around and play on a swing in a tree that my grandpa built for hours and hours and hours. And I remember being back there, and I was walking along the property line next to the neighbor's backyard, and their backyard had a lot more trees in it. It's kind of a lightly wooded area. And amongst the trees, all of a sudden, just feet in front of me, appeared this kind of mountain lion cougar thing. And I blinked and it disappeared, but I was so spooked and scared, I ran directly into the house. And now in Kentucky, we don't have mountain lions. We do have wildcats, but I know what those look like. And they're not as big as what I saw. I mean, however, I was a child. Children exaggerate. And of course, this all could have just been in my mind, like my overactive imagination or whatever. But it felt so real. And actually, the second time that I saw an animal spirit that wasn't there happened when I was in college as an adult. So I've seen animals that weren't really there. And this was the first time that I remember seeing something like that. I have no idea what that means, what it was, I don't know. I usually just say that it was just a product of my imagination, it was nothing there, but who knows? Who knows? Weird lion cougar thing. Walking amongst the trees in my grandparents' neighbor's backyard. So let's move forward to the time period between 1998 and 2006, and this is when we lived in a slightly bigger town. At that time, this town had around 20,000 people, so it actually had a Walmart and a movie theater. Oh boy! But this is the same town where my grandparents lived. And we moved there because they had a better school system, and so my parents wanted my sister and I to go there for middle school and high school. So we moved there in 1998, and around that time I was 10 years old, 10 going on 11, and I remember at around that age, sometime between the ages of 10 and 12, I woke up one morning with this song in my head, and I can hear it to this day. Like, this feels like such a familiar song, but I've never in real life heard the song before. I've never heard it being performed. I've never heard anybody else sing it. It's just a song that I knew. And it felt so familiar to me. And it was a song about freedom. And the lyrics were, "My freedom is to be like waves of the sea, crashing, crashing towards me. Freedom, freedom, when will that day be? Freedom, freedom, when will it come to me?" Those were the lyrics of the song, and I can hear the tune of it. I'm not going to sing it because I can't. I'm a terrible singer. I can't carry a tune. But where the hell did that come from? And so a part of me has explored the possibility of it being something from a past life that I remembered. And I don't know. Like I said, I approach most things with skepticism. And so it could just be a moment of creativity. It could just be a product of my subconscious that decided to come out right before I woke up that day, or it could be some sort of memory or link to a past life. I don't know. But it just felt so familiar. That's the thing. It felt old and familiar. So who knows what that was. And this will be the last story for this part of the video. When I was in high school, probably my sophomore or junior year of high school, I saw my first ghostly apparition. So, a group of my friends and I, including my very best friend in the whole wide world, we were at a friend's house for a sleepover. And I think we're all somewhere around 15 or 16 years old. And now this friend, whose house we were staying in that night, she had told us that her house had some paranormal activity. Because they claimed, or she claimed, the ghost of the old man who lived in the house before them was hanging around in the house and didn't really like them being there very much. And so she told us stories of them coming home after everybody was out of the house the whole day, but then they would come home and they would find the box of cereal that was on the countertop. All of a sudden it would be under the kitchen table and no one put it there. Or her sister told us a really creepy story of how she woke up one night seeing a man standing over her bed. And so we all kind of, I can't say that I walked into the environment of that house fresh on a blank slate, because we had all heard the stories that this friend had told us about her house. But when we were hanging out in the back of the house where the kitchen was, we were all sitting around the kitchen table, and I remember my best friend and I, we were sitting across each other at the table, and we were kind of, to our left was the hallway that led to the living room and the other bedrooms further up the house. And I remember not really in other parts of the house, but specifically in the kitchen room area and in that hallway area, my best friend and I felt really uncomfortable, like something didn't want us to be there. And we would ask our other friends who were sitting around the table with us, and none of them felt anything. So maybe my best friend and I have some sort of sensitivity or something, I don't know. But I just remember feeling really uncomfortable in that part of the house. Feeling like something did not want me to be there. And so we're talking, we're hanging out, and then out of the corner of my eye, to my left, I see a full-bodied apparition in like a black form of a man, and he appeared out of one wall in the hallway. He paused, looked over his shoulder like this at us, and then walked into the wall on the other side of the hallway and disappeared. And that is the first and so far only time I've seen an apparition like that. And I was scared. I looked across the table at my best friend, and we both said at the same time, "Did you just see that?" And so I want to pause and underline this, because if I'm by myself and I think I see something out of the corner of my eye, or I hear something, I can just explain it away like, oh, it's an overactive imagination, I've been watching too many ghost TV shows, or I'm just hearing things, it could be explained, you know, it's nothing, blah, blah, blah. But when you see something at the same time that someone else sees it, and when it is so clearly the dark outline of a man, that walks into and disappears into the wall, I think that's saying something. Like, if I had witnessed it by myself, I would doubt and just kind of downplay what I saw. But the fact that my best friend sitting across the table saw it at the same time that I did gives a little bit more credence to it. And it was intense. It was intense, and it definitely made me, at the time, a believer. Now, that is probably the most important experience I've had, especially in the first 18 to 20 years of my life, that made me question my skepticism. Because I have the image ingrained in my brain. I can see the spirit just looking over his shoulder and then continuing forward and disappearing into the wall. It was formative. Let's just say that. And actually, now that I'm looking down at my notes for everything that happened between 2006 to the present moment, a lot of, I would say the amount of paranormal events or weird things that I've experienced has, if not been steady, or, well, it seems like it's increased. Let's just say that. Or at the very least, it's been pretty consistent. So, yeah. I'm going to end this video here. So this was part 1 of my childhood through adolescence and teenage years paranormal experiences. I don't know what to make of them. I'm going to try to keep my mind open, but I know, at least in the case of that last story, when my best friend and I saw the same thing at the same time, I saw something. And it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I mean, how could it have been if another person saw it at the same time as me? You know? I'll just leave it at that. And stay tuned for part 2, where I talk about more recent experiences.